We often hear of novels being written that were inspired by a true story or event, but a true story inspired by a novel is much less common. Elizabeth Jane Cochrane. You know her, right? No? Well, what about her pen name, Nellie Bly? Well, if not, do not worry, I didn't know about her either until I put on my research hat for this episode of Beyond the Book. Hello and welcome to Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark, and today we are going to look at the remarkable journey of Nellie Bly, a journey inspired by today's book choice, Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. So rather than going into the publication history and things which I've done before, and all different kind of adaptations and things like that, I thought I would concentrate instead on the story of Nellie Bly, of whom I'm going to tell you about in a second. I did find a few interesting facts out about this, of course. One of them especially, which I thought was it's an early example of product placement, apparently. Several companies mentioned in the book did so because they lobbied Verne to be mentioned, so I thought that was kind of cool. Transportation companies and things like that. It's also very interesting to note that in so many film adaptations that there's always a hot air balloon featuring, and of course in the book there isn't, so sorry to spoil that if that's what you were hoping to see. Anyway, so let's carry on, shall we? I love this book, I really do, and it easily fits into my top 10 favourites of all time. And it also is apt because, of course, Sean D. Standfast and I are running August of Adventures, and it is a book that would fit very nicely into that. We are not doing it ourselves this year, but of course, if any of you want an excuse to read it, then that would be a great excuse for you. Anyway, as I say, I absolutely love this book, but like a lot of people, I didn't really know anything about any story that might have been connected to it or surrounded it. We all know the premise, of course, of this book about a rich English gentleman and his French manservant who embark on an 80-day travel around the world to win a bet. And of course, on the way they have lots and lots of fun and interesting, challenging adventures too. So how does this tie in with our Nellie Bly, and who was she? Well, let's get a bit of background information first. She was born in 1864 in a place called Cochrane's Mills, in Pennsylvania, which was incidentally founded by her father and therefore named after him. She was actually her father's 13th daughter. Can you imagine that? He had some sons as well. I didn't see exactly how many children he had, but 13 daughters. Blimey. But sadly, her father did pass away when she was 10, but I suppose after having sons and then also 13 daughters, he was probably quite old. In fact, I know he was old. He was 54 when she was born, so yeah, there you go. So he would have been 64 when he died. And that meant that she had to be raised by her mother. She went to school, of course, and then on to university, but had to drop out after the first term or so because of money issues. After a response to an article called What Are Girls Good For?, the editor of the newspaper, the Pittsburgh Dispatch, tracked her down. She had actually used a pseudonym to write her response called Lonely Orphan Girl. That's pretty sad, isn't it? So he tracked her down and offered her a job. And it was while she was working at the Pittsburgh Dispatch that she adopted this name, this pen name, Nellie Bly, after apparently a popular song of the day. Interestingly enough, the spelling was wrong. The editor wrote the wrong spelling. So instead of what the song is, which is Nelly, she became Nellie. Anyway, so most of her early work at the paper was spent reporting on the lives of working women and, of course, the conditions they were working in at the time, which were very poor. And this meant that many of the employers of the women that she was investigating, so factory owners, people like that, complained to the paper about her, and she found herself reassigned to the so-called women's pages to report on things like fashion, society, gardening, etc. And for a girl like Nellie, this was absolutely not her cup of tea, and she grew bored. Still only 21 years of age, she managed to get a post of foreign correspondent and went off to Mexico. And for 6 months, she reported on life in Mexico, culture of Mexico, and all that kind of stuff. And, she published a book of her experiences there, imaginatively called 6 Months in Mexico. However, it was only 6 months because she found herself in trouble again, and this time with the Mexican government, because through her articles she protested their despotic president, and she was forced to flee Mexico or face imprisonment. Once back at the Pittsburgh Dispatch, she found herself once again with work that didn't suit her or excite her, such as reporting on arts and theatre goers and theatre productions. So she left the paper and decided to move to New York City, and whilst there she found it very difficult to secure employment. People just weren't hiring that many women, and she was pretty close to borderline destitution when she was able to talk her way into an interview at the New York World, a paper incidentally owned by Joseph Pulitzer, of course, of Pulitzer Prize fame. She was offered the chance to take on an assignment, which she accepted, and it was an undercover assignment. She surely must have been one of the early pioneers of investigative and undercover reporting, even not just for women, but probably for both genders. And this assignment meant that she had to, this is crazy really, well it is crazy, you'll see in a second, she had to pretend insanity. So she had to feign insanity and get herself committed to an asylum. To be more precise, the Women's Lunatic Asylum on what is now known as Roosevelt Island in New York. That is really some dedication to her journalistic art, as it were. And of course the reason for this was to report from the inside on so-called brutality within the care system at the time. She spent 10 days locked up in this lunatic asylum, and afterwards she was able to publish a book about her experiences, again imaginatively called 10 Days in the Asylum or something like that. The book and the publicity surrounding this gave her celebrity status, and actually did lead to reforms within the asylum itself. So prior to Nellie going through these adventures in lunatic asylums and annoying the Mexican government, and prior to her embarking on her journalistic career, our man, the author Jules Verne, published his famous adventure novel Around the World in 80 Days back in 1872 to much acclaim, and I think rightly so. Really, in my opinion, I think it's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's great fun, and as I say, why not read it for August of Adventures? Bly, Nellie, obviously thought so too, and in 1888 she approached her editor about undertaking Phileas Fogg's fictional journey for real, a journey of some 40,000 kilometers, or 20-something thousand miles, perhaps, for our American friends. And the New York World agreed to it. They were completely on board, and a year later, she set off. In fact, 9:40 a.m. on November the 14th, 1889, to be precise. She took with her a small bag, and she wore only the dress she had on. Though, thankfully, she packed plenty of changes of underwear in her bag, along with other essentials. She carried some £200 in British banknotes and gold, as well as a smaller amount of American currency in a small pouch that she had secreted about her neck there. Funnily enough, at the same time, the Cosmopolitan magazine decided to send its own female reporter to rival Nellie and Fogg. And Nellie had no idea that she was in a race until she got to Hong Kong and she heard of the Cosmopolitan's correspondent, Elizabeth Byland. The New York World ran a competition while this was going on. They ran this competition for their readers to guess how long to the second it would take Nellie to complete the trip. And the grand prize for this competition was a trip to Europe plus spending money. Nice. Nellie pretty much followed the same route as Fogg and Passepartout, with one really cool slight detour, which was actually while she was in France to go and meet and talk to Jules Verne himself. I think that's wonderful. I think that's really, really wonderful. I'd love to know what they talked about. Perhaps there's a book about Nellie. I need to really look that up because I think she's so far a remarkable woman. I'd like to read more about her anyway. The development of submarine cables, of course, allowed her to keep in touch with New York through the telegraph and keep them updated as to her progress. And of course, they were able to leave information for her as well. The most difficult part of the journey, though, was the Asian leg of the journey, especially with regards to infrastructure. But it didn't stop her visiting lepers in China, and she even bought a monkey in Singapore. I do wonder what became of it, though. Finally, she arrived back on US soil 2 days behind schedule, so not bad going. But luckily, rather than risking going over the 80-day mark, her paper, the New York World, came to her rescue and chartered a private train to bring her from San Francisco to New Jersey. I cannot imagine how much that would have cost. So 72 days, 6 hours and 11 minutes after she left on her journey, Nellie arrived back in New Jersey, having beaten both Fogg and her competition, Elizabeth Byland, who arrived 4 days or so later. Nellie's journey at the time was a world record, but it only stood for a few months until the new fastest time became 67 days, then it fell to 60 days, and then in 1913, one enterprising trio managed to get this time down to just 36 days. So that's the story. Beyond the book, Around the World in 80 Days. In case you're interested in Nellie, I'm not going to leave it just there. I will let you know what happened later in life. She went on to get married, a millionaire even, she married. Lucky girl. And she became a novelist, though she didn't give up journalism entirely, and actually reported from the front lines during World War I, even at one point finding herself being arrested as a possible British spy. She also reported a lot on the suffragette movement before sadly dying in 1922 at, I think, the young age of 57, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is a really remarkable story of a remarkable woman. So thank you very much for watching this episode of Beyond the Book, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Do take care, everybody. Bye bye. Brother,